For 2 years, Vivian Ashcroft believed she was the wife of the most powerful man in New York. She wore his ring, slept in his bed, and learned to love a man who kept the city afraid. Then one night, at his own charity gala, behind a closed door she was never meant to stand beside, she heard him say it plainly. No hesitation, no remorse. Vivian is useful, but she'll never be my real wife. 2 years. Gone in 8 words. If you've ever loved someone who treated you like a strategy, this story is for you. Like and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels.
Samush istanen astamashamtan.
The gown was the color of champagne and it cost more than most people made in 3 months. Vivian knew this because she had been there when Damien's personal stylist laid it out across the hotel suite bed like an offering, smoothing the fabric with both hands as if it were something sacred. She had not chosen it herself. She never chose anything herself anymore. That was the part nobody outside the DeLuca penthouse understood. That being the wife of Damien DeLuca came with every material comfort imaginable and almost no freedom at all. She wore the gown anyway. She always wore what was selected for her. The Meridian Grand in Midtown Manhattan had been transformed into something obscene with wealth. The DeLuca Foundation's annual charity gala was not about charity, not really. It was a demonstration, a spectacle staged for the benefit of politicians, corporate rivals, foreign investors, and the kind of men who smiled in photographs and ordered violence in private. Vivian had attended 3 of them now. She knew the rhythm. She knew which faces to smile at and which conversations to exit gracefully. She had become very good at performing the role of Damien DeLuca's wife without ever being asked if she actually wanted the part. 2 years. That was how long the contract had been in place. 2 years since her father's shipping company had been swallowed by a DeLuca acquisition, and the only way to preserve her family's name, her mother's dignity, and her younger brother's future had been to sign a document that looked, to the untrained eye, like a marriage certificate. She had been 26. She had not been naive about what it was. But naivety and hope are 2 different diseases, and Vivian had made the mistake of contracting the second one somewhere along the way. The ballroom shimmered. Crystal chandeliers caught the light and shattered it across hundreds of polished surfaces. The champagne flutes, the silverware, the jewels on the throats of wives who may or may not have chosen their own gowns. A string quartet performed near the far wall with the kind of precision that felt inhuman. Vivian stood near the champagne table and watched Damien work the room from a distance, which was her usual position. She had learned early that he preferred her close enough to be seen and far enough not to interfere. He was extraordinary in rooms like this. She had to admit that every time. Damien DeLuca moved through a crowd the way weather moved through open country. Not hurrying, not pausing, simply present in a way that made everyone else feel peripheral. He was 41, broad-shouldered, with dark hair gone silver at the temples and eyes the color of slate during rain. He wore authority the way other men wore cologne, naturally, without effort, in a way that made you aware of it before you could name what you were noticing. She watched a city councilman laugh too loudly at something Damien said. She watched a federal prosecutor shake his hand with both of hers. She watched a man she recognized as the head of the Carrera organization cross the room to greet Damien with the careful deference of someone approaching a border they could not afford to cross wrong. This was her life. Watching. Her glass was nearly empty. She reached for a fresh one off the tray of a passing server and felt the cold of the stem against her palm, grounding herself in the small physical sensation. 3 more hours, maybe 3.5. Then the car would take them back to DeLuca Tower, and she would sit across from Damien in silence for 20 minutes, and then they would go to their separate wings of the penthouse, and that would be another gala survived. She was thinking this, turning the phrase over in her mind, another gala survived, when she saw Damien excuse himself from the councilman and move with purpose toward the far corridor that led to the private offices the venue kept reserved for its most significant clients. 2 men followed him. She recognized them. Marco Vitale, Damien's underboss, a heavy-set man with a boxer's hands and a stillness that always made Vivian slightly uneasy, and Renato Cassi, who handled the organization's financial relationships and spoke in the measured cadences of someone who had spent decades learning never to say anything that could be used against him. This was not unusual. Men stepped away from galas for conversations the ballroom couldn't hold. Vivian knew better than to notice. but her champagne glass was empty again. She had drained it faster than she realized. And the server had moved to the other end of the room, and the nearest table with drinks happened to be in the direction of that corridor, and so she walked toward it without particular urgency, without thinking anything was different about this particular evening. She heard Damien's voice before she saw the door. The corridor was quiet. The ballroom noise became muffled behind her as she moved away from it, the thick carpet absorbing her footsteps. The private office was the third door on the left, and it was not fully closed. A slice of warm light fell across the hallway floor. Vivian slowed without deciding to slow. Something in the register of the conversation, low, clipped, the kind of tone men use when they are discussing things rather than performing them, made her feet stop. She should have kept walking. She stood approximately 4 feet from the door, close enough to hear clearly, far enough that no shadow of hers broke that thin line of light. Renato was speaking first. She caught the tail of a sentence. The perception among the Fontaine family is that your position has been softened, Damien. They see a married man and they think wrong, Damien's voice, flat and immediate, the way he shut things down. The Fontaine family thinks what I allow them to think. They're not alone in wondering, Marco said. His voice had the grain of someone who chose his moments carefully. There's been talk, among our own people, that the arrangement has become personal. A pause. Vivian was not breathing. Let them talk, Damien said. It doesn't affect operations. It affects your image, Renato pressed. The kind of image these families respond to. Fontaine, Greco, the Russians, all of them are watching to see if the De Luca organization has... He paused with the precision of someone choosing a word the way you'd choose a weapon. Softened at its center. Another silence. Longer this time. When Damien spoke again, his voice was even, unhurried, the voice he used for facts. Vivian is useful to me, he said. She's a public face, respectable. She handles the civilian side of the foundation work competently. She doesn't ask questions she shouldn't ask. A beat. But she'll never be my real wife. Everyone in this room knows what the arrangement is. Use that if you need to. If the Fontaine family needs reassurance that I haven't gone soft over a contract marriage, give it to them. The room was silent. Vivian's hand was against the wall. She did not remember putting it there. That should satisfy Fontaine, Renato said, his voice lighter now, the tension in it resolved. The Greco family as well. If they know the arrangement is strictly... She stopped listening. Not because the words stopped. They continued. She could hear the rhythm of them. The way the conversation shifted toward logistics and timelines, and something about a shipment clearing the port authority. She stopped listening because there was a sound inside her chest that was louder than anything happening in that room. A sound that wasn't quite pain yet, more like the moment before pain, the moment when the body understands what has happened but the mind is still catching up. She'll never be my real wife, said cleanly, without cruelty, which was almost worse than cruelty. Said the way you state a fact about weather or inventory. Said without hesitation because why would there be hesitation? It was simply true. She had always known it was true. The contract was clear. The terms were clear. She had signed with her eyes open, and yet she had told herself she was not hoping for anything. She had constructed a very careful internal architecture around that belief, reinforced it every time Damien placed a hand at the small of her back in a crowd, every time he remembered that she didn't eat shellfish, every time he sat across from her at dinner and asked what she had read that week with what seemed like genuine interest. She had told herself all of that was just the performance of a man who was meticulous about his performances. But she had not believed her own story. Not entirely. Not in the places you can't reach with logic. She walked back to the ballroom. She did not run. She was not shaking. Not visibly. Her face, she was fairly certain, was still the same face she'd worn all evening. One of the skills you developed as the public wife of Damien De Luca was the ability to present a surface that told people nothing. She was good at it by now, professionally good. She took a glass of champagne from the nearest tray and stood where she'd been standing before, near the edge of the room, in the spot that had become her default position at these events. She drank. The chandeliers caught the light the same way they had 20 minutes ago. The string quartet played something that someone had once told her was Vivaldi. The councilman was still laughing too loudly somewhere behind her. Everything was exactly the same, and Vivian Ashcroft was someone else entirely. She was still standing there, her second glass, or her third, she had stopped counting, when she felt the weight of something across her shoulders, heavy, warm. She looked down and saw the dark fabric of Damien's suit jacket settled around her. He had appeared beside her without announcement, which was a thing he did constantly, and which had once seemed like attentiveness and now seemed like the practiced deficiency of a man who managed assets. "You're cold," he said. Not a question. She hadn't been cold. She hadn't noticed she was cold. But her arms had apparently been bare in the air conditioning, and he had noticed before she had, which was exactly the kind of thing that had made her stop believing her own careful story about not hoping. "Thank you," she said. He stood beside her for a moment. She could feel the heat of him through the jacket. She was wearing the evidence of his consideration, and underneath it she was completely hollow. He said something about leaving in an hour. She said that was fine. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, with the specific quality of attention he sometimes turned on her that she had never been able to fully categorize. Then someone across the room caught his eye, and he excused himself and moved away. An hour later, in the back of the car, she watched the lights of Manhattan slide past the tinted window, and she did not say anything, and neither did he, and the silence between them, which had always felt like a particular kind of companionable quiet, now felt like the precise shape of everything she would never have. She did not cry that night. She lay on her side of the enormous bed in the DeLuca penthouse, 15 floors above the city, and she thought about the specific word he had used. Useful. She turned it over in her mind the way you'd press your tongue against a cracked tooth, not because it feels good, but because you need to confirm the damage is real. Useful. Like infrastructure. Like a service. She had been useful for 2 years. She thought about all the small details she had accumulated over that time, and she organized them now into a different taxonomy, sorted them into 2 piles, the things that were genuine and the things that were efficient. His jacket on her shoulders tonight went into the efficient pile. So did the shellfish allergy. So did the questions about her reading. A man who managed his image this carefully would know the reading habits of his contract wife the same way he knew the quarterly projections of his hotel division. She was still doing this, reorganizing her entire understanding of 2 years, when the light through the curtains began to gray toward dawn. She hadn't slept. She did not sleep the next night either. The first thing she changed was the coffee. It had been her ritual. Hers, the one thing in the penthouse she had made genuinely her own, to be in Damien's private office on the 42nd floor by 7:15 on mornings when he had early meetings, to have the French press prepared and his preferred newspaper section already open on the desk. It was not something she had been asked to do. She had started it in the 3rd month of the marriage because she had found herself awake early with nothing to anchor her to the day, and it had felt like a useful, there was that word again, thing to do. And he had never commented on it, never thanked her for it directly, but she had noticed the way he'd look at the desk when he entered the room, the brief settling of something in his expression, the way a person looks when they find a thing in its expected place. She stopped going. He noticed by the second morning. She knew because she heard him pause in the doorway to the office. She was in the sitting room down the hall with a book she was not reading, and the pause lasted longer than it should have. Then he walked in without saying anything. She began sleeping earlier, not because she was tired. She was rarely tired, her mind too loud for easy sleep. But because if she was in bed by 9, she did not have to be in the sitting room when he came home from whatever occupied him until midnight. And she did not have to perform the quiet company of a woman who was exactly where she wanted to be. She stopped straightening his tie before meetings. This was smaller, more intimate, and she understood that stopping it would register differently. The tie had been another one of her inventions. She had done it once early in their arrangement because he was clearly distracted by something and had knotted it crookedly, and she had reached up without thinking, and he had gone completely still in a way that had surprised her. After that, she had just done it when she noticed it needed doing. It was not something they had discussed. It existed in the margin of their arrangement, in the space that was neither contractual obligation nor its opposite. She did not touch his tie again. She watched him register this too, in the way that Damien DeLuca registered most things, with no visible expression and a stillness that meant calculation was occurring beneath the surface. He was not a man who asked questions when he could observe and deduce instead. This was a quality she had once found fascinating and now found suffocating. The penthouse was 6,000 square feet. For the past 2 years, Vivian had moved through it the way she moved through the gala. Present, carefully positioned, attending to detail. Now she moved through it like a guest who knew her checkout date. She packed no bags. She made no announcements. She simply contracted into herself, taking up less and less space, quieter by degrees, until she suspected she could probably walk the length of the apartment without anyone being quite certain she was there. The staff noticed first, the way staff always noticed. She saw it in the extra carefulness of Elena, the housekeeper, who had started setting Vivian's tea things with a slight hesitation, as if she were not sure whether this was still the right thing to do. The driver, a taciturn man named Gus, who had worked for the DeLuca family for 9 years, began checking the rearview mirror more frequently when he took her to her foundation obligations, watching her face with the wariness of someone anticipating weather. She had always liked Gus. She liked him more now that he had the dignity not to say anything. What she had not anticipated was Damien's response, which was not what she would have predicted from a man who had described her as a public face. He doubled her security. She first noticed the second car on a Tuesday afternoon when she was walking 3 blocks to the independent bookstore she had been visiting since the 3rd month of her marriage. One of the few places she went that was not on the official schedule, not a foundation meeting or a charity lunch or a public appearance. She had a habit of buying too many books she didn't have time to read, and she wasn't sorry about it. The second car was discreet. She had to grant him that. But she had spent 2 years observing Damien DeLuca's security arrangements, and she knew what an unmarked sedan with 2 men in it meant when it parked half a block behind wherever she happened to be. He thought someone had threatened her. The understanding arrived with a clarity that should have felt like relief, and instead felt like another form of being unseen. Of course, that was what he thought. In his world, behavioral change had external causes. People retreated because they were afraid of something outside themselves. It did not occur to him, evidently efficiently, that the thing she was retreating from was inside the penthouse. She found out later through one of those organizational accidents that happened when security details weren't careful about being overheard, that he had ordered investigations into 3 separate rival crews, that 2 of them had faced what the news reported as internal disputes in the following weeks, and that a 3rd organization had abruptly relocated their operations to a different borough without public explanation. He had dismantled organizations because he thought they might have frightened his contract wife. She sat with this information for a long time. It did not make her feel what she thought it would make her feel. Isabella Moreau arrived on a Thursday. Vivian knew who Isabella was. She had known since the 1st month of her marriage, when a DeLuca family attorney named Hargrove, an older man with the practiced neutrality of someone who had seen everything and documented most of it, had sat across from her in the foundation's legal offices and said, with careful indirection, that there were several relationships predating her arrangement with Damien that she should be aware of, in the spirit of full understanding of her situation. Isabella was the daughter of Claude Moreau, who ran the most significant organized crime operation in the south of France, and had substantial interests in Monaco, Geneva, and 3 ports in Italy. She was 34, educated at Sciences Po, reportedly brilliant, and had grown up alongside the DeLuca organization's European partnerships in a way that created the kind of history that got described as complicated when lawyers were being careful. Before Vivian's arrangement had been structured, there had apparently been discussions, not contracts but discussions, about a different kind of alliance. In the end, Vivian's father's shipping network had made the Ashcroft arrangement more strategically useful in the short term. She had not needed Hargrove to explain that part. She had understood it immediately and had taken a private, bleak satisfaction in being able to recognize precisely what she was. Isabella arrived at DeLuca Tower at 2 p.m. in a car that was probably bulletproof and wearing something that Vivian recognized in the flat register of a person no longer interested in feeling things about fashion, as exactly the kind of effortless European dressing that made American women feel like they were trying too hard. She was dark-haired, elegant, with the kind of composure that came from never having had to perform it because it was simply structural. Vivian was in the building's private lounge on the 40th floor when Isabella came through, an accident of timing she had not engineered and which she would have preferred to avoid. She was sitting with a cup of tea she had barely touched, reading the same paragraph of a novel for the 4th time, When the elevator doors opened and Isabella crossed toward the private reception corridor that led to Damien's operational offices, Damien was already there. He came through from the inner corridor the way he always moved, economically, without wasted motion. And when he saw Isabella, his expression did not change, but his posture shifted by some tiny fraction that Vivian had spent 2 years learning to read. He said something in French. Isabella replied. They were perhaps 12 feet from where Vivian was sitting, and neither of them looked at her. Not from rudeness exactly, but from the absorption of people with urgent things to discuss. Then Isabella reached into her bag and produced a folder, thick, sealed, and Damien took it from her with the practiced ease of someone receiving something expected. His hand. Isabella's hand. The folder passing between them. And then Damien said something brief and businesslike and placed his hand at Isabella's back to guide her toward the corridor, and the gesture had the automaticity of a movement that had been made before, more than once, in different rooms. Vivian looked back down at her book. She read the same paragraph again. She did not think about what she had seen. She was past thinking about individual images. She was in the phase of simply receiving information and filing it in the pile she had been building since the gala, the pile that was not about evidence or proof, but about the aggregate weight of a truth she already knew and was still in the process of deciding to act on. That evening, she opened her laptop and spent 4 hours researching publishing internships in Boston. She had a degree in English literature from Columbia. She had written her thesis on narrative compression in contemporary American fiction, a narrow, earnest piece of academic work that her thesis advisor had called genuinely perceptive in the careful way academics used to mean not commercially viable but personally promising. She had not done anything with it since. The marriage arrangement had not specifically required her to give up professional ambitions, but it had required presence, availability, the kind of ongoing readiness that made employment impractical. The foundation work technically counted as employment, but it was DeLuca employment, which meant it was another form of the same arrangement. There was a small publishing house in Boston called Meridian Press. Not a major player. Literary fiction, some nonfiction, the kind of operation that ran on passion and insufficient margins and produced books that won prizes no one had heard of except the people who cared about prizes. They had posted an editorial internship 2 weeks ago. 6 months, with the possibility of extension. The salary was modest. The apartment situation would require solving. She filled out the application at 2 a.m. while the penthouse was quiet. She did not tell anyone. Over the following 3 weeks, she corresponded with Meridian's editorial director, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who wrote emails with the brisk affection of someone who had read too many cover letters and was grateful to find one with a sentence structure she respected. She sent a writing sample. She sent her thesis abstract. She answered questions about her editorial instincts with the specific pleasure of someone being asked about the first thing they had ever actually cared about. Ruth offered her the position on a Friday afternoon. Vivian accepted it within the hour. She booked a one-way flight to Boston for the following Tuesday. She did not book a return. She told no one in the DeLuca household. Not Elena, not Gus. She packed a single large suitcase over several nights. Gradually, taking only what was hers, her books, which filled most of the suitcase, her laptop, her personal documents, which she had always kept in a small locked case that was hers from before the marriage. The expensive things, the gowns, the jewelry, the DeLuca family heirloom ring that Damien's advisors had placed on her finger at the contract signing, she left where they were. She kept only the simple ring that had been there at the beginning, a thin band of white gold with a small diamond, nothing extravagant. She had assumed it was a placeholder until the heirloom arrived. She had never asked. She had kept it in her jewelry drawer since the night the heirloom replaced it, and she picked it up now and held it in her palm for a moment before setting it back down. She left it. Monday night, she did not sleep. She lay in the dark and ran inventory on herself with the detachment of someone reviewing a property they were about to vacate. 2 years. She had arrived here at 26, believing she understood exactly what the transaction was, and she was leaving at 28, with the particular education of someone who had been correct about the terms and wrong about how they would feel. That was on her. She was willing to own that. You didn't get to hold a man accountable for facts he had stated plainly from the beginning. What she was not willing to own was the coat at the gala, his jacket over her shoulders on the cold terrace, the morning coffee ritual he had never once asked for, and had accepted every time as though it were simply part of the room. The way he'd asked about her reading, the shellfish allergy, still somehow present in the memory of every dinner arrangement his staff made 2 years later. These things existed outside the contract. She had not invented them. She had not hallucinated the specific quality of attention he sometimes turned on her, not the performance attention he used in public, but the quiet kind, in private rooms, the kind that meant something was being perceived rather than managed. She was not crazy. She was not naive. She was simply the woman who had made the mistake of hoping in a house full of men who confused strategic clarity with an absence of feeling, and she was leaving before the weight of that hope became the only thing defining her. The suitcase was by the door of her room. The flight was at 8:15 in the morning. She closed her eyes and counted the hours, and somewhere in the counting she drifted into something that was not quite sleep and was visited by nothing she could remember afterward. At 6:30 in the morning, Damien DeLuca was already awake. This was not unusual. He had always slept briefly and lightly, a habit he'd developed in his 20s when the threats to his organization had been less abstract, and a man who slept deeply was a man who didn't wake up. The habit had stayed with him even as the nature of the threats evolved. He was in the kitchen when he heard the particular sound of a wheeled suitcase being moved across hardwood floors. He stood very still with his coffee in his hand. The sound stopped. Then it continued. Then it stopped near the main corridor. He set the coffee down. When he stepped into the corridor, Vivian was standing near the foyer with a suitcase beside her and a coat over her arm, and the specific stillness of someone who had expected to leave before being seen. She was wearing dark slacks and a simple blouse. Her own clothes, not the foundation wardrobe. She looked, he thought, like herself. The version of herself that existed underneath the gala gowns and the public wife architecture. He had only seen this version in private, in the early mornings before the day's arrangements began, and the fact that this was the version standing at the door with a suitcase landed in his chest with a weight he did not immediately have a category for. He looked at her, at the suitcase, at her face, which was giving him nothing. "Where are you going?" he asked. She looked at him for a moment before answering. "Boston," she said. The word dropped into the hallway with the weight of something final, and Damien stood there, coffee cooling on the kitchen counter 20 feet away, and felt the floor beneath his carefully managed world shift in a way no rival organization, no federal investigation, no decade of running an empire built on precise and ruthless intelligence had ever made it shift before. He did not understand what was happening, which was, in itself, a sensation he did not have a protocol. He did not understand what was happening, which was, in itself, a sensation he did not have a protocol for. He stood in the corridor and looked at her in the suitcase and the coat folded over her arm and the specific arrangement of her face, composed, resolved, the expression of a person who had made a decision and had made it so thoroughly that it had already become architecture. And the part of his mind that was always running calculations ran them now and came back empty. He could not locate the variable. He could not find the threat. "Boston," he repeated. "I accepted a position, an editorial internship at a publishing house." She said this with the evenness of someone reading from a document. "I'll send you the contact information once I'm settled, for legal purposes." Legal purposes. He said it the way he repeated things when he was buying time, which she probably knew because she knew more of his tells than he was entirely comfortable with. "Vivian, the car's coming at 7. Cancel it." Something shifted in her face. Not breaking. She wasn't close to breaking, he could see that, and the steadiness of it unsettled him more than tears would have. "No." He took one step toward her, not aggressive, measured, the way he moved in rooms where the temperature was uncertain. "Someone threatened you. Someone got to you. Tell me who and I will—" "No one threatened me, Damien." "Then what is this?" She looked at him for a long moment. The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere outside the penthouse windows, Manhattan was beginning its morning noise. Distant sirens, the low hydraulic groan of the city waking up. But in here it was just the two of them, and the suitcase, and the 7 feet of space between them that felt like much more. "I'm leaving," she said. "That's what this is." He did not move. His jaw tightened by a fraction. She saw it. She had always seen it. That particular micro-expression that meant he was containing something rather than releasing it. "You have obligations, the Foundation Gala in December, the Hargrove Review in November. You can't simply—" I'm aware of the schedule. Her voice was still level. I'll submit a formal notice to the foundation board. My absence can be managed. You've managed larger complications than a wife who doesn't show up to charity events. The word wife landed in the corridor between them with a strange weight. He heard the edge in it, slight, precise, the edge of a woman who had chosen her word with full knowledge of its charge, and something in his chest registered it before his mind caught up. This is not how we handle things, he said. How do we handle things? She asked it quietly and with genuine curiosity, the kind that had no warmth in it. He didn't have an answer that satisfied even himself. The elevator arrived at 7, and Vivian walked out of DeLuca Tower with one suitcase and a coat and 2 years of her life folded up inside her chest, where it would live quietly for a long time. Damien stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of the 42nd floor and watched the car pull away from the building's private entrance, and he stood there after it disappeared into the flow of morning traffic, and he stood there for a while longer than that. Then he picked up his phone and called Marco. Marco Vitale had been Damien's underboss for 11 years. He had the quality of a man who had survived a long time in a dangerous business by understanding exactly what was and wasn't being asked of him. When he arrived at the penthouse 40 minutes later, he found Damien already in operational mode, suit jacket on, the particular stillness that meant he was focused. And he read the room with the accuracy of someone who had been reading this specific man's rooms for more than a decade. She left, Damien said. Not a question. I know, my guy on the door called it in. Marco sat across from him. Boston. Publishing job. Find out who got to her. Marco was quiet for a beat. You think this is external. What else would it be? It was not phrased as a question. Marco recognized that too. He had a thought, and he looked at Damien and he decided, with the pragmatism of a man who wanted to continue doing his job, to keep the thought to himself for now. I'll run it down, he said. I want to know about every contact she's had in the last 3 months. Anyone who approached her at Foundation events. Anyone she's corresponded with that wasn't organizational. That's going to be a significant I want it by Thursday. Marco nodded. Okay. He paused. The Fontaine meeting is tomorrow. They're going to notice she's not here. Then they notice. Damien looked out the window. Tell Renato to handle the social side. He's good at it. Marco left. Damien remained at the window for another several minutes, and then he went into his office and opened his laptop and began working, which was what he did when the world produced variables he couldn't yet solve. He worked. He organized. He controlled the things that could be controlled, and he filed the others under pending, and he operated on the professional certainty that everything was solvable if you had sufficient information. He told himself he was not worried. He was not a man who worried. He was a man who acted. He told himself this several times over the course of the morning. In Boston, Vivian's flight landed just before 10. Ruth Calloway had arranged a sublease on a small apartment in Cambridge, reasonable distance from the Meridian press offices, reasonable rent, unreasonable drafts in winter according to Ruth's email, which had also included the phrase bring actual blankets, not decorative ones in a way that Vivian had found unexpectedly warming. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building that smelled like old wood and radiator heat. And when she opened the door for the first time, she stood in the entrance and looked at the modest space. No staff, no security, no one whose job was to anticipate her needs before she had them. And she felt something in her chest loosen. Not happiness exactly. Something earlier than happiness. The preliminary condition for it. She put her suitcase down. She found a grocery store 3 blocks away. She bought coffee and milk and bread and soup and a book she'd been wanting to read for 6 months from the tiny used book shelf near the register. She paid with her own card. She had always maintained her own accounts, one of the small pragmatic decisions she'd made at the beginning of the arrangement, and she was grateful for it now, with a gratitude that felt almost physical. She made coffee in the small apartment kitchen and drank it standing at the window looking out at Cambridge in October, and she thought about nothing in particular for the first time in 2 years. The Meridian press offices were in a converted building near Harvard Square, and Ruth Calloway turned out to be exactly as her emails had suggested. Compact, direct, with reading glasses perpetually on her head, and the particular intensity of someone who had dedicated her career to books that didn't make money and had no regrets about it. She shook Vivian's hand and took her on a 10-minute tour and assigned her to a manuscript pile by the end of the afternoon. We're behind on everything, Ruth said without apology. Welcome to independent publishing. Vivian sat down at the small desk that was hers and opened the top manuscript and read the first page and felt, with a precision that surprised her, like herself. Back in New York, Marco's Thursday report arrived, and Damien read it in his office on the 42nd floor with the door closed. The report was thorough. Marco was always thorough, and it documented Vivian's contacts over the past 3 months with the granular completeness of an organization that had surveillance assets embedded in most of its operating environment. The conclusion was clean: no external contact, no threat, no approach from a rival organization. The publishing internship was real, applied for and accepted through entirely legitimate channels. Correspondence with a Ruth Calloway at Meridian Press beginning approximately 6 weeks ago. A flight booked on a consumer airline website. A Cambridge apartment sublease arranged through the press. Damien read the report twice. He sat with it for a long time. The thing that Marco had not said on Monday morning, the thing he had looked at Damien and decided to keep to himself, was becoming impossible to keep from himself. It was right there in the report, in the absence of anything external. No threat, no manipulation, no rival organization. The variable was internal. The variable was the only thing the report couldn't document because it was inside the penthouse, inside a marriage that was not a marriage, inside 2 years of an arrangement that Damien DeLuca had managed with his customary precision and which had, apparently, at some point he could not identify, produced a result he had not calculated for. She had simply decided to leave. Not because someone had forced her, not because of Isabella, or the Fontaine situation, or any external pressure point he could have addressed with the tools he had. She had left because she had wanted to leave, and she had made that decision on her own terms, and she had executed it with a cleanness that, if he was honest, which he rarely was about things like this, he recognized. It was the way he made decisions, thoroughly, without looking back. He called her that evening. She picked up on the 4th ring. Vivian. Damien. Her voice was the same. He had not known what he expected, but it was the same. Are you settled? A brief pause. Yes. The apartment. It's fine. I want to send someone to... No. The word was flat and complete, no negotiation space around it. He was silent for a moment. You don't have security out there. I don't need security. I'm an editorial intern in Cambridge. Vivian, is there something you need, Damien? Legally, organizationally. Her voice was courteous and absolutely impenetrable. If there's a foundation matter or a legal requirement, I'm happy to... There's no foundation matter. Silence. Then I'm going to go, she said. Good night. She ended the call. He sat in his office with the phone in his hand and the report on his desk and the penthouse very quiet around him, and he thought, for the first time and with a clarity he could not immediately classify, that he might have made a mistake. Not a tactical mistake. Not the kind of mistake you corrected by deploying resources. A different kind. The kind that didn't have a correction procedure because you couldn't go back to the moment it happened, and you couldn't fully identify the moment it happened, and everything you would normally use to fix a problem was exactly the wrong instrument for this one. He was still sitting there when his phone rang. Renato, about the Fontaine terms. He answered it and spoke for 30 minutes about shipping routes and capital positioning and the strategic value of 3 ports in the Gulf, and he did it with his full professional intelligence because that was what he did, and that was who he was, and the rest of it sat in the back of his chest like a stone he had not yet decided what to do with. In the weeks that followed, the DeLuca organization noticed. Not all of it. The organization was large and compartmentalized, and most of its members were concerned with their own operational realities. But the inner circle noticed. Marco noticed. Renato noticed. Even Hargrove, the family attorney, noticed when Damien appeared at a scheduled legal review with the specific quality of distraction that was deeply unlike him. Present in body, operating at a slight remove that Hargrove cataloged without comment and filed under not my business. Damien doubled down on work. He always doubled down on work. He restructured 2 divisions of the hotel portfolio. He handled the Fontaine negotiations personally and concluded them favorably within 10 days, which was faster than anyone expected. He ran 3 organizational audits simultaneously and found 2 loyalty problems he dealt with in the direct fashion of a man who did not believe in prolonged uncertainty. He called Vivian every 3 days. She answered about half the time. When she answered, the conversations were brief and civil and told him nothing. She was well. The work was interesting. Boston was colder than she'd expected. She didn't need anything. She asked him nothing in return. Not about the organization, not about him specifically. And the absence of her questions, which he had once found professionally convenient, now had a quality he did not have a precise word for. It felt like being looked through. Isabella Moreau called him on a Wednesday in the third week of October. She was in New York for 2 more days on the Moreau organization's business, something involving the Monaco accounts and a restructuring of the European partnerships that required his direct engagement. And she wanted to know if he was available for dinner. He said yes because the Moreau relationship was significant, and because Isabella was a professional contact of long standing, and because there was no reason to say no. They ate at a private dining room in the back of a restaurant that the DeLuca organization maintained for exactly these purposes. A room with no windows and no ambient sound, and the kind of privacy that allowed for direct conversation. Isabella ate well and spoke well, as she always did. She discussed the partnership restructuring with the precision of someone who had been raised to understand this business from childhood. She was, he acknowledged again, genuinely exceptional at this. The analysis, the positioning, the ability to hold competing strategic interests in balance without sentimentality. Toward the end of dinner, she looked at him over her wine and said, "She left." Not a question. "She took a position in Boston," he said, same words he'd been using. Isabella was quiet for a moment. She set her wine down. "Damien, I know what she heard at the gala." He looked at her directly. "Renato told me," she said, not maliciously. He mentioned it in the context of the Fontaine resolution, explaining why the public narrative had needed adjusting. She paused. "What you said. About her." The room was very quiet. "It was a position," he said. "A strategic... I know what it was." Isabella's voice was even, without judgment or satisfaction, which somehow made it harder to deflect. "I've been in rooms where people say things like that. I've said things like that. I understand the function." She picked up her wine again. "But Damien, she heard it." He said nothing. "You managed her like an asset," Isabella said. "That's what you do. That's what we all do, with the people who are attached to us in these arrangements. We manage." She looked at him with the clear eyes of someone who had no personal stake in his answer. "The problem is that somewhere between the contract and the gala, she stopped being an asset to you, and you never adjusted your management accordingly because you didn't notice. That's not... You doubled her security when she pulled back. You investigated 3 organizations." She looked at him steadily. "You don't do that for assets, Damien. You do that for people you can't stand the thought of someone hurting." The private dining room was very still. "I don't know what you're suggesting I should have done differently," he said, and his voice was controlled, but the control was doing more work than it usually did. "I'm not suggesting anything," Isabella said. "I'm observing. You're good at observation. I thought you might find it useful to know what someone else observes from the outside." She finished her wine. "I'm not your competition here. I never was. The Moreau partnership has always been organizational. You know that. I know that." He sat with this for a moment. "She thinks you and I... She probably thinks many things," Isabella said. "The question is whether you're going to let her keep thinking them in Boston." He said nothing. Isabella put her napkin on the table and signaled for the check. "The Monaco restructuring," she said, her voice returning to its businesslike register as cleanly as a door being closed. "I'll send the revised terms by Friday. I think we can be aligned on this." He nodded. Professional. Automatic. He drove back to DeLuca Tower alone, and he went to the 42nd floor, and he stood at the window, and he looked at Manhattan spread out below him. All that light, all that organized power, the machinery of an empire that ran on his intelligence and his discipline and his willingness to do what other men couldn't do. And he tried to locate, with some precision, the moment when Vivian Ashcroft had gone from a calculated arrangement to the thing Isabella had named. The thing he couldn't name. He went back in his memory with the methodical honesty of a man doing a genuine audit. The shellfish allergy. He had noted it in the first month because he noted everything relevant about people in his operational environment. But at some point he had stopped thinking of it as a data point and started thinking of it as a fact about Vivian, which was a different category. The morning coffee, he had not asked for it, had not expected it, and the first morning it was there, He had felt something that he had filed at the time as satisfaction at organizational efficiency, and which he now understood, with the flat clarity of a man finally being honest with himself, was not that. The gala. His coat on her shoulders. He had done it without thinking, had crossed the room toward the balcony with the specific awareness of where she was and what she needed, and he had not analyzed the impulse because it had not felt like something that required analysis. It had felt like the most natural thing. He stood at the window for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Marco. "I need to know everything," he said. "Not surveillance. I need to know how she's actually doing out there, who she's talking to, whether she seems—" He stopped. The sentence didn't have an ending he was willing to say aloud. Marco was quiet for a second. Then, "Okay, boss. Don't crowd her. She'll notice." "I know." He put the phone down. He stood at the window for another moment, and then he moved to his desk and opened the file on the Fontaine terms. And he worked, because working was what he did. But underneath the work, the stone in his chest had become something else, had developed an edge, a direction, a quality that he finally identified in the small hours of the morning when the building was entirely quiet and there was nothing left to distract him from it. It was not strategy. It was not calculation. It was the plain, unmanageable fact that he wanted her to come home, and he had no instrument in his considerable arsenal for making that happen, because every instrument he had was built for a world where things could be forced or bought or outmaneuvered, and this was not that world. This was the world where he had said 8 words without hesitation into a barely closed office door, and a woman who had spent 2 years learning every tell he had been standing 4 feet away in the corridor, and she had heard all of it, and she had stood under the chandeliers for the rest of the evening without breaking, and she had worn his coat home, and she had not said a word. And then she had left, with one suitcase, her books, her own card, like someone who had been planning the exit long enough to make it clean. He called her the next morning. She didn't answer. He did not leave a message because he did not know what the message would say, which was the most foreign sensation he had experienced in 20 years of running an organization built on knowing exactly what to say and when to say. He called her the next morning. She didn't answer. He did not leave a message because he did not know what the message would say, which was the most foreign sensation he had experienced in 20 years of running an organization built on knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. He called again that evening. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Damien." Her voice was the same as always, level, courteous, the voice of a woman who had decided to be composed and had followed through. He had learned to hate that voice in the past 3 weeks. He had learned to hate it because it was the voice she used with everyone now, with him and with the foundation liaisons and probably with the woman at the bookstore register, and he knew because he had heard a different voice once, quieter, less careful, the voice she used in the early mornings in the penthouse before she had assembled herself for the day. And he knew the difference. "I need to see you," he said. A pause. "Why?" "Because there are things that need to be said in person." "Damien, not for the organization, not legal. For us." He said it flatly, without softening it, because he had never learned to soften things, and this was not the moment to start performing a version of himself that didn't exist. "I'm asking." The silence on the line was long enough that he counted it. "I have work on Saturday," she said finally. "Sunday." Another pause. "I don't want you to come here." "Then tell me where." She chose a coffee shop near Harvard Square, which he understood as a tactical decision. Public space, controlled environment, no penthouse architecture around them, and no DeLuca staff in peripheral vision. He agreed to it without comment. He told Marco he was going to Boston, and Marco looked at him with the expression of a man carefully not saying several things and simply said, "You want a driver?" or "I'll drive myself." Marco's expression did not change. "Okay." He drove himself to Boston on a gray Sunday morning in November with the kind of weather that couldn't decide between rain and not rain, the sky hanging low and colorless over the highway. He did not play music. He had never been a man who needed noise to fill space, but the silence in the car on this particular drive had a texture he was aware of, a quality of anticipation that he was not accustomed to. He had walked into rooms where men wanted to kill him with less awareness of his own pulse than he felt now, which was information he received without comfort. The coffee shop was the kind of place that Cambridge produced in reliable abundance. Small, cramped with bookshelves along the walls, the smell of dark roast and old wood. He arrived 8 minutes early, and she arrived 4 minutes after him, which meant she had also arrived early and waited somewhere else until close to the time. He recognized this as a thing he would have done, and the recognition landed with a complicated weight. She looked different, the same and different. The Cambridge version of Vivian had her hair down in a way she rarely wore it in New York, and she was in a gray sweater and dark jeans and the kind of worn leather bag that said she had chosen it for function rather than performance, and she looked like a person who had been living her own life for 6 weeks and had been doing it. He assessed with the involuntary precision that he applied to everything, with some degree of success. She sat across from him, ordered coffee without looking at the menu, which meant she had been here before. He ordered the same. "You drove," she said. "Yes." "I assumed you'd fly." "I drove." He put both hands on the table. He had not prepared a speech. He had rehearsed approximately nothing, which was deliberate. He was better when he worked directly from the facts, without scaffolding. "I know what happened at the gala." Something shifted in her face, small, controlled. "Do you? You heard the conversation. In the corridor off the private offices, with Marco and Renato." He watched her. "You heard what I said." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Yes." "I want to explain. You explained in the hallway," she said, "the morning I left. You said it was strategic, that you were protecting me from being seen as a vulnerability." Her voice was even. "I understood you. I'm not confused about what you meant." "Then why?" "Because understanding something and being able to live inside it are two different things." She said it without heat, which was more definitive than heat would have been. "I understood what the arrangement was from the beginning. I'm not holding you to a contract that never promised what I wanted from it. That's not what this is." He was quiet. "What this is," she said, "is that at some point I stopped experiencing it as an arrangement, and I know that's on me. I know you were always clear. You were clearer than most people are about anything." She looked at him directly. "But I was living in that penthouse, and you were asking about my books, and you remembered that I don't eat shellfish, and you put your coat on my shoulders, and I—" She stopped. The evenness in her voice developed a hairline fracture, then she sealed it. "I made a mistake. I started hoping for something the contract never included, and then I heard you say it plainly, and it was like being handed the receipt for something I hadn't known I was buying, and I needed to leave." "Vivian," he said. "I'm not asking you to apologize," she said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm here because you asked to meet, and I thought—" She paused. "I thought it was the adult thing to do, to hear you out." He leaned forward slightly. "What I said at the gala wasn't the truth." She looked at him. "It was a position," he said. "The Fontaine family, the Greco organization, several others, they were watching for signs that I had developed a vulnerability. In this business, a man's wife becomes a target the moment anyone believes she actually matters to him. I said what I said to protect you, to make sure no one in that room would look at you and see a lever they could use." His jaw was tight. "That was the calculation. That was the only calculation." She was quiet for a long moment. "So protecting me," she said slowly, "meant telling 3 of the most powerful men in your organization that I was nothing. It meant so that they would pass it on," she continued, her voice gaining the specific quality of a person working through logic in real time and not liking where it arrives. "So the Fontaine family would hear it, the Greco organization. So everyone who might want to use me against you would hear from your own mouth that there was nothing to use." She looked at him. "Is that right?" "Yes." "And it worked?" "Yes." "And at no point," she said, "did you think to tell me that this was what you were doing, why you were saying it?" The silence that followed was the longest one of the morning. He did not have an answer for this. He had an explanation. He could construct one. He could explain that in his world, you didn't brief people on protective measures because the protection depended on the briefed person not knowing, not reacting, not accidentally confirming through their behavior the very thing the measure was designed to conceal. He could explain all of this, and it would be accurate, and it would also be, as Vivian's expression told him she already knew, completely beside the point. "No," he said. "No," she repeated. "I handled it as an operational matter. he said. I managed the threat to you the way I manage every threat, without accounting for the fact that you were not simply... He stopped, and the stop had a rawness to it that he was aware of and could not entirely help, that you were not simply a variable in the operation. Vivian's eyes were steady on him. They had always been steady. That was one of the first things he had noticed about her, the way she looked at things without flinching, and right now that steadiness was the most difficult thing in the room. You only realized I existed, she said quietly, after you thought you were losing me. The coffee shop noise went on around them. The grinder, someone's laptop, two students at the next table arguing about something in the cheerful way of people whose arguments have no real consequences. And Damien DeLuca sat across from his contract wife in a Cambridge coffee shop on a gray November morning and felt, with the full and unmanaged force of a thing he had been containing for weeks, that she was right. He had noticed the cold coffee. He had noticed the tie. He had noticed every small withdrawal with the acuity of a man who noticed everything, and he had pointed his entire organization's resources at the wrong cause, because it had been more comfortable to believe in an external threat than to sit in the truth of what the withdrawal actually meant. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long moment after that. Then she picked up her coffee and looked out the window at the gray Cambridge street and said nothing for a while. And he let her because he had used up whatever gave him the right to push. I need time, she said finally. I don't know what I want from this yet. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not performing a role in your architecture. She looked back at him. Can you understand that? Yes. Then let me have it. He drove back to New York that afternoon and he told Marco the meeting had happened and Marco asked how it went and Damien said, she needs time. And Marco nodded, and that was all. He sent flowers to the Cambridge apartment the following Friday. No note. He was not ready for words yet, and he did not want to misuse them. The second Friday, he sent them again. The third Friday, she'd called him afterward, briefly, just to say she had received them. He did not push. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. He sat in his office after the call and understood that this was the pace, her pace, not his, and that his entire life had been run at his pace, on his terms, in his timing, and that this was the cost of that. He could pay it. He would pay it. What he was not prepared for was what happened on a Tuesday in late November, when Marco arrived at the 42nd floor in the middle of the afternoon, with a particular quality in his stillness that Damien recognized over a decade of working together as the quality of a man carrying something heavy. Marco closed the office door. There's a problem, he said. He put a folder on the desk. Damien opened it. The first page was a photograph. It took him 3 seconds to understand what he was looking at, and another 2 to understand what it meant, and in those 5 seconds his entire understanding of the past 2 months shifted the way tectonic plates shift, not gradually, but in the compressed catastrophic instant when accumulated pressure finds its release. The photograph showed Renato Cassi in a private dining room. Across from him was a man named Sylvester Lund, who ran the operational communications for the Fontaine family's New York interests. They were sitting close in the way of men having a conversation they did not expect to be photographed. When was this? Damien said. 3 weeks ago. We got it yesterday. One of our people in the Fontaine network finally moved. What's the content? Marco's jaw was set. Renato's been communicating with Lund since before the gala, since the summer. He paused. The conversation at the gala the one about Vivian, the one where you made the statement about the arrangement, Renato called Lund the same night. Damien was very still. He told Lund that your wife was a contract placement, that there was no emotional attachment, that she was a public face and nothing more. Marco put a second page on the desk. Lund passed it to Fontaine's underboss within 48 hours, which means Fontaine's people knew what I said before the end of that evening, Damien said. His voice was completely quiet, the specific quiet that his organization had learned to fear more than any raised voice. Yes, before Vivian could have told anyone. Yes. Damien turned one more page in the folder. His eyes moved across it without expression. There's more, Marco said. Tell me. Renato's been feeding the Fontaine network information for 8 months. Financial positioning, shipping schedules, nothing critical yet, but the trajectory is clear. Marco sat down, the first time he had sat in this conversation. He was building toward a realignment, moving his interest to the Fontaine side before the European partnership restructuring closes. If the Moreau deal goes through, Renato's position in the De Luca organization becomes less essential, Damien said. He's protecting his future. At my expense. Damien's hand rested flat on the folder. At Vivian's expense. Marco was quiet. The things I said at the gala, Damien said, and his voice was still that terrible quiet. Renato used them. Not to protect the organization. He used them with Fontaine as evidence that my position had softened, that I had emotional exposure. His eyes were on the middle distance. He did the opposite of what I intended. He confirmed what I was trying to deny. It looks that way. And if Fontaine's people believe I have a genuine vulnerability in Vivian, they've been running surveillance on the Cambridge address for at least 2 weeks, Marco said. The office was completely silent. Damien closed the folder. He put both hands flat on the desk, and he sat with this for 10 seconds, 20, and Marco let him, because Marco understood that what was happening in those seconds was the kind of recalculation that required space. The man across the desk from him was not panicking. He had never seen Damien De Luca panic in 11 years. But he was doing something Marco had also never seen, which was arriving at a personal cost he had not budgeted for and feeling the full weight of it without looking away. Renato, Damien said finally, I have eyes on him. He doesn't know we know. Keep it that way. He stood up. The decision was already made. Marco could see it complete in his face, the whole operational response already structured. I want the Fontaine surveillance on Cambridge terminated within 24 hours, quietly. I don't want her to know there was a threat. Damien, she will not be used as leverage in this organization or any other organization ever again. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Handle it. And Renato. I'll handle Renato myself. Marco stood. He picked up the folder. He looked at Damien for a moment with the expression of a man who had something to say that wasn't operational and made a decision about whether to say it. She should know, he said. About the surveillance, about Renato. She has a right. She has a right to build her life in Boston without my problems following her there, Damien said, which is what I'm going to make sure of. That's not what I mean, and you know it. Damien looked at him. You told her the gala conversation was protection, Marco said. And it was. But now you know that Renato burned it the same night. Everything you said to protect her. He turned it into a weapon against her. Marco set the folder down. She doesn't know that the man who was supposed to be managing her safety was the one feeding her exposure to your enemies. She doesn't know how close Fontaine's people have been watching her. He held Damien's gaze. If you keep that from her, you're making the same choice again, managing her as a variable instead of Marco. I know. He picked up the folder again. I know. I'll handle the surveillance. He left. Damien stood at the window. Outside, Manhattan ran its usual machinery. The traffic, the light changing, the indifferent enormity of a city that had no awareness of the interior architecture of the man looking down at it. He had built the De Luca organization on the principle that information was protection and that the man with the clearest picture of reality made the best decisions. He had believed this for 20 years. He had run his entire operation on this belief. He had a clear picture now. Renato had been in his organization for 9 years, had been at his table for 9 years, had been present at the gala, had helped construct the very statement that Vivian had overheard, and had then taken that statement and handed it to his enemies the same night, had used Damien's protective instinct as the instrument of the exposure it was designed to prevent. The layered precision of the betrayal was, in a detached professional sense, almost admirable. Renato had understood exactly what he was doing. He had known that Damien's denial would read to Fontaine as confirmation. He had known that Fontaine would move on the intelligence. He had known that Vivian, in Cambridge, with no security and no awareness, was now a person the Fontaine organization had filed under potential asset. She was in Cambridge right now, reading manuscripts. She did not know any of this. He picked up his phone. He called her number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and he stood there with the phone in his hand and the voicemail beeping, and he said nothing. He ended the call. He called Marco. The Cambridge surveillance, he said. How close have Fontaine's people been? Close enough that they know her schedule, the bookstore, the route she takes home. Can they get to her? Marco's pause was half a second too long. In a controlled environment, yeah, they could. Move up the timeline, Damien said. Tonight. On it. He put the phone down and he thought about Renato and the 9 years and the folder on the desk, and he felt, in the part of himself that had spent 2 decades learning to manage what he felt so that it did not compromise his decisions, something that was not manageable. It was not rage exactly. Rage was something he knew how to channel, how to direct, how to make useful. This was different. This was the sensation of standing in a room where every wall you had built had been turned by someone you trusted into the walls of a cage, and the person trapped inside it was not you, but the woman who had trusted you enough to stay 2 years and had not trusted you enough to stay a third. And she had been right. She had been right not to trust the architecture he had built around her, because the architecture had a crack in it that he had not seen, and the crack had a name, and the name was Renato Cassi, and Renato was sitting right now in his apartment on the Upper East Side believing he had another week before anything moved. He did not have another week. Damien was in the car 20 minutes later. He did not take his usual detail. He took 2 men, Gus, who drove, and a man named Carver, who had been with the organization for 6 years and had the quality of someone who understood that certain evenings required a specific kind of silence. They moved through Manhattan in the black sedan with no announcement, no advance communication, no one notified in the organizational structure that could have a connection to Renato's network. The Upper East Side building was pre-war, expensive, the kind of address that said a man had done well for himself over a long career. Damien had helped Renato acquire the apartment 7 years ago. He thought about this in the elevator, the specific texture of having provided the infrastructure for a man's comfortable life, and what that meant now. Renato answered the door in a dinner jacket, half-dressed, clearly heading out. His face when he saw Damien did the thing faces did when a mind was running calculations under a surface. It was trying to hold steady. He was good. He had always been good. Damien had believed for 9 years that Renato's composure was the composure of loyalty. Damien. Smooth. Almost right. I wasn't expecting me. No, Damien said. You weren't. He walked in. Carver stayed at the door. Gus remained in the car. Renato stepped back with the involuntary movement of someone whose body understood something their mind was still negotiating, and Damien moved into the apartment's sitting room and turned and looked at him. Sit down, Renato. Renato sat. Damien did not sit. He stood and he looked at the man across from him with the full, undiluted attention he reserved for situations that required absolute clarity, and he let the silence run for a count of 10, 15, long enough that Renato's composure developed the first visible fault line, a tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the mouth. Sylvester Lund, Damien said. The fault line deepened. 3 weeks ago, Damien said. The restaurant on 61st. You had the duck. He had the fish. You talked for 90 minutes. Renato's hands were on his knees. They did not move, but the stillness of them was the kind that required effort. That was the most recent meeting, Damien said. There were others, 8 months of others. He tilted his head slightly. You want to tell me what we talked about? Or should I tell you what I already know? Renato exhaled through his nose. A controlled breath, the breath of a man deciding which version of this to attempt. The Fontaine relationship is a structural reality, he said. Any organization operating on the East Coast maintains communication channels with stop. Damien's voice was not loud. Don't do that. You're too good for that, and I have too much on tape for that. The word tape landed visibly. Renato's jaw moved. The gala, Damien said. The same night. You called Lund within 2 hours. You told him what I said about Vivian. You told him the arrangement was contract only, no emotional attachment. He watched Renato's face with the clinical attention of someone reading data. You handed him the intelligence I generated to protect her, and you gave it to the people most likely to use it against her. That's not, Renato started. You've had Fontaine's people watching her in Cambridge for 2 weeks. The room went completely quiet. Whatever Renato had been about to say did not get said. He looked at Damien, and for the first time the composure was not a managed performance, but simply gone. The way a structure is simply gone after the thing that was holding it up is removed, and what was underneath it was the face of a man who understood that the conversation had arrived at its actual location. I didn't authorize surveillance on her, Renato said. His voice had changed register. Less construction, more truth. That was Fontaine's decision. I passed intelligence. I didn't. You passed intelligence that made her a target, Damien said. You knew the architecture you were feeding it into. You knew what Fontaine's organization does with information about exposed positions. His voice was still quiet. The quietness was doing enormous work. You were 9 years in this organization, Renato. You know exactly what happens next when Fontaine identifies a vulnerability. Renato looked at him. Something moved through his face. Not remorse exactly, but the recognition of a man who had made calculations that had extended further than he intended or had chosen not to look at where they were extending. She was supposed to be a bargaining position, he said. It wasn't supposed to go to operational. But it did. I didn't know Fontaine would move that fast. You knew Fontaine, Damien said. 9 years, you've known exactly how Fontaine moves. You knew. He looked at him for a long moment. You're telling me you didn't know because you need to believe you didn't know. That's not the same thing. Renato had nothing left to say. The Moreau restructuring, Damien said. When it closes, your position in the organization becomes redundant. That's what this was about. You were building a bridge to Fontaine before the floor came out from under you. His voice was still even, but the evenness had a quality in it now like the surface of deep water. Smooth on top, pressure all the way down. I would have found you something else, Renato, if you had come to me. Renato looked at his hands. I know, he said quietly. But you didn't come to me. No. Damien stood there for another moment, looking at a man he had trusted for 9 years, and then he made the calls that needed to be made, and Renato Cassi did not go to his dinner that evening. At 11:45 that night, Damien's phone rang. It was Carver, on a secondary line. The Cambridge situation is resolved, Carver said. Fontaine's people pulled back. Confirmed? Confirmed, all 3 positions. And our coverage on the building? Running clean. She doesn't know we were there. He put the phone down. He sat in the back of the car as Gus drove back through the city, and he looked out at the wet streets. It had started raining at some point, the kind of November rain that had no particular ambition, just a low, steady presence. And he thought about what Marco had said. If you keep that from her, you're making the same choice again. He knew Marco was right. He also knew that calling Vivian at midnight on a Tuesday to tell her that a trusted member of his organization had been feeding her location to enemies for 8 months was not a call that made things better. It was a call that confirmed every reason she had left. It was a call that said, the life you escaped from reached you in Cambridge anyway, and I'm the reason it could. He did not call her. He told himself he would tell her when it was fully resolved, when Renato's network was completely contained, when the Fontaine exposure was closed on all sides, when he could tell her the whole thing at once, as a completed fact rather than an ongoing situation. He told himself this, and he knew, with the honesty he was practicing in the absence of any other option, that part of the reason he was waiting was that he was afraid, which was a word he had not applied to himself in a very long time, and which fit badly and precisely. He was afraid that if he told her, she would hear it as confirmation of the things she already believed, that proximity to Damien DeLuca made the world more dangerous, not less, that being his wife, even in name only, had made her a target in a world she had never chosen to inhabit, that the best thing she could do was stay in Cambridge, stay away, stay out of the blast radius of his life. And he was afraid she would be right. He was still carrying this when the call came in on a Thursday morning at 7:40, and the caller ID showed a Cambridge area code he did not recognize, and he answered it with the immediate focus of a man whose attention does not require a warm-up. Mr. DeLuca, a woman's voice. Professional, controlled, with the specific cadence of someone delivering information they did not want to be delivering. My name is Ruth Calloway. I'm the editorial director at Meridian Press. Vivian has listed you as an emergency contact. His hand tightened on the phone. What happened? She's at Cambridge General. There was an incident last night outside the office. Someone followed her. Ruth Calloway's voice had the deliberate steadiness of a person who was frightened and managing it. She's going to be all right. But she has a concussion and a dislocated shoulder, and she's asking for you. He was already standing. I'm on my way, he said. He did not call Marco. He called Carver directly because Carver had been on the Cambridge operation and would understand the situation without requiring full briefing, and he said 4 words, "Get me to Boston." And Carver said 20 minutes, and that was all. The drive was 3 hours and 40 minutes at the speed Gus drove when he had been told there was no time to waste. Damien sat in the back, and he did not work, and he did not make calls, and he did not look at anything except the road ahead, which was wet and gray and very long. He thought about the 3 surveillance positions Carver had confirmed were cleared on Tuesday night. He thought about all 3 positions. He had assumed 3 was complete. He had assumed the Fontaine Network's Cambridge operation was a 3-point setup because that was standard for that kind of operation, and Carver had confirmed 3 positions, and he had accepted the confirmation. He called Carver. "The Cambridge clearance Tuesday," he said. "3 positions confirmed." "Yes." "Was there a 4th? Silence. The silence of a man running back through his work. "I mapped 3 active positions based on the intelligence from Marco's contact," Carver said slowly. "If there was a 4th, it would have been established after the handoff, after our source's last report." "When was the last report?" "Sunday." "And the incident was Wednesday night." The silence on the line was 3 seconds long and contained a complete and mutual understanding. "I'll find out where it came from," Carver said. "Do that," Damien said, and ended the call. Cambridge General was a gray institutional building with fluorescent corridors and the particular smell of hospitals everywhere. Antiseptic and something underneath it that was simply human damage, the accumulated physical cost of bad luck and bad nights. He walked through the entrance at 11:20 with Carver beside him, and a nurse at the information desk looked up and assessed him with the accuracy of someone who dealt with a wide range of human situations and said, "Room 214. She's awake." Vivian was sitting up in the bed when he came through the door. Her left arm was in a sling. There was a bruise along her jaw that was the dark purple red of something that had happened with force. She had a small cut above her eyebrow closed with 2 strips of medical tape. She looked at him when he came in, and her face did the thing it had always done. It told him nothing deliberately. It gave him only what she decided to give him. But she had asked for him. He crossed the room and stopped at the side of the bed, and he looked at her face, at the bruise, at the sling, and something in his chest moved in a way that had nothing to do with calculation and everything to do with the plain, unmediated fact of her being hurt in a world he was supposed to have made safe. "Vivian." "I'm okay," she said, preemptive, already managing his reaction. "You're not okay." "I will be." He sat in the chair beside the bed. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and he looked at her. "Tell me what happened." She told him. She had been leaving the office at 8:30. Late, she'd been finishing a manuscript. A man had followed her from the building, staying 2 blocks back. And she had noticed because she had learned over 2 years to notice. She had changed direction twice to confirm it. When she cut through a side street toward a more populated block, the man had closed the distance, and there had been another one waiting at the end of the street. And what happened next had been brief and physical, and she had fought. She said this with the flat factual register of someone reporting. She had fought and screamed and a car had stopped and the men had run, but not before she had been thrown against a brick wall hard enough to dislocate her shoulder and hit the back of her head on the pavement. Damien listened to all of this without moving. "The police came," she said. "I gave them descriptions. They're looking." She looked at him with the steadiness he had always known her for, and which now was the most difficult thing in the room to meet. "It wasn't random, was it?" He held her gaze. "Tell me the truth," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't random." She absorbed this. Her right hand was on the blanket, and he watched her fingers press flat against it, a small, grounding gesture. "This is connected to you." "Yes." "How long?" He told her. He told her about Renato, the 8 months, the gala conversation, and what Renato had done with it the same night. He told her about the Fontaine surveillance in Cambridge, about Tuesday's clearance, about the 4th position they had missed. He told her all of it in the flat sequential register of a man who had decided that the only remaining debt he owed her was the complete truth. And he watched her face as he told her, and he did not look away from any part of what he saw there. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, the room was quiet except for the corridor sounds outside. A cart moving, someone's voice at the nurse's station. "You knew about the surveillance Tuesday," she said. "Yes." "And you didn't tell me." He held her gaze. No, I didn't. Why? Because I thought I'd contained it, he said, and because he stopped, and the stop was not evasion but the specific difficulty of a man saying something true that he had not said before. Because I didn't want you to know how far it had reached, how close. His voice was even, but it cost him. I thought if you knew, you would understand that being connected to me had made you a target, and I would have made my own decision about what to do with that information, she said. Her voice was not loud. It was very precise. I know. That's what you keep doing, she said. You keep making decisions about what I can know, what I should be protected from, what I'm equipped to handle. She looked at him with the full, exhausted clarity of someone who has been in a hospital bed for 12 hours with a concussion and a dislocated shoulder and still has not lost the thread of the essential argument. You managed me at the gala. You managed me when you doubled security without telling me why. You managed me when you cleared the surveillance and said nothing. Damien, you manage everything and everyone around you, and you call it protection, and it's not. Her voice cracked on the last word, the first crack she had allowed, and she did not repair it immediately. It's control, and I understand why. I understand the world you built and why you built it this way. But you cannot keep doing it to me. You cannot keep deciding what I'm allowed to know about my own life. He sat with this. The hospital room was very bright in the way of rooms built for visibility rather than comfort. He looked at her face, the bruise, the taped cut, the eyes that were holding him with the unflinching directness of someone who had just been physically hurt by the consequences of a world she never chose, and who was still, in this moment, choosing to have the real conversation rather than the manageable one. You're right, he said. She looked at him. I have been doing that, he said. Since the beginning, I managed you into the arrangement. I managed your position in the organization. I managed the threat at the gala by making a decision about your exposure without telling you I was doing it. I managed Renato and the surveillance without telling you. He looked at her directly. I told myself every time that it was protection. Some of it was. And all of it was also control. And I know the difference, and I used the first word because the second one was harder to live with. The room held this. Vivian's right hand was still flat on the blanket. She looked at him for a long time with the expression of a person who is assessing something for the last time before deciding what to do with it. I want to go home, she said. His chest compressed. Not to the penthouse, she said quickly. To my apartment, Cambridge. I want to go home to my apartment, and I want to sleep, and I want to think. She held his gaze. And I want you to let me do that. Without sending anyone to watch the building. Without calling every 3 days to check. Without... She exhaled. Without managing it. There's still a security concern, he said. Renato's network isn't fully... Damien. He stopped. Can you do that, she said. Can you let me go home and just... wait. Without orchestrating it. He looked at her face, the bruise, the cut, the steady, exhausted, entirely undefeated eyes. He thought about everything he could deploy, the security he could arrange, the ways he could structure her safety without her knowing he was structuring it. He thought about all the instruments he had, and how all of them were the wrong instrument, and how the right instrument was the one he had spent his entire adult life refusing to pick up, because it required something from him that couldn't be optimized or controlled or managed into a position of strength. It required him to simply trust her, to let her be in the world without his hands around the architecture of it, to wait. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she nodded, once, the nod of someone who has received an answer and is not yet sure what to do with it, but is willing to carry it forward. He stayed until the doctor came and reviewed her discharge instructions. He helped her into her coat, carefully, because of the sling, and she let him, which was something. He called her a car to the apartment, and he did not send Carver with it. He stood outside the hospital entrance in the cold November air, and he watched the car pull into traffic, and he stood there after it was gone. The way he had stood at the window of DeLuca Tower watching a different car pull away 2 months ago, and the cold came in through his jacket, and he let it. His phone rang. Marco. Renato's network, Marco said. We've got the full map now, the 4th Cambridge position. It was run by a man named Dietz, freelance, hired through a Fontaine cutout after the Tuesday clearance. He's been picked up. And the Fontaine side? Their underboss is requesting a conversation. They're claiming Renato acted on intelligence they received in good faith, that they didn't have full picture of Damien. They want to negotiate. He stood outside the hospital in the cold. Tell them, he said, that the conversation happens in New York, on my terms, this week. And if they push back on the timeline? Damien looked at the street where Vivian's car had disappeared into Cambridge traffic. He thought about a woman with a dislocated shoulder and a bruise along her jaw reading manuscripts in an apartment she had chosen for herself, in a life she was building without him, who had just told him the truest thing anyone had told him in 20 years. Then they push back, he said, and they find out what it costs them. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood there for another moment in the cold and the low gray light of a Cambridge November, and then he walked to his car, and the decision that had been forming in him since the hospital room, since before that, since the coffee shop, since the penthouse corridor, since the gala, solidified into something complete and irrevocable in his chest. The way decisions did when they were no longer decisions, but simply the decision that had been forming in him since the hospital room solidified into something complete and irrevocable in his chest. The way decisions did when they were no longer decisions, but simply the truth of what a man was going to do. He got in the car. New York, he told Gus. Gus pulled out of the Cambridge General parking lot without a word, and they drove south through the gray afternoon, and Damien sat in the back with his phone face down on the seat beside him, and he thought about the Fontaine underboss and Renato Cassi and 9 years, and the specific weight of a woman's right hand pressed flat against a hospital blanket, grounding herself in the physical world while she said the truest things anyone had said to him in 2 decades. He thought about what it was going to cost him to fix this. Not Vivian. He was not naive enough to think that was a thing you fixed, a relationship you repaired through operational efficiency, the way you repaired a compromised network. He thought about what it was going to cost him to become the kind of man that fixing it would require. And he sat with the full price of that and did not look away from any part of it. The Fontaine meeting happened 2 days later. Victor Fontaine's underboss was a man named Garrett Poole, silver-haired, 60-something, with the weathered composure of someone who had survived in a violent business by being genuinely difficult to read. He arrived at the DeLuca Building's private conference room with 2 men and a lawyer, which was the correct amount of caution for a meeting called under these circumstances. Damien was already seated when they came in. Marco stood at the wall to his left. The lawyer opened a folder. Poole looked across the table at Damien with the measured attention of a man taking inventory. "Mr. DeLuca," he said, "the Fontaine organization wants to be clear that the Cambridge operation was conducted on the basis of intelligence we received through a source we considered reliable. If we had known the intelligence was—" "Stop," Damien said. Poole stopped. "You're going to tell me Renato misrepresented his authorization and that Fontaine acted in good faith on compromised intelligence. You're going to present this as a miscommunication between organizations rather than a directed operation against a civilian." Damien looked at him with the complete attention that his organization had spent years learning to fear. "I've read the communication logs. I know what Renato told Lund. I know what Lund told your operation. I know the timeline. I know the 4 surveillance positions, and I know who ran the 4th one, and I know it was established after my team cleared the first 3, which means someone in your operation knew my team had cleared 3 and adjusted accordingly." "There's 6. He let this sit. "That is not a miscommunication." Poole was quiet. "A woman was hurt," Damien said. "A civilian woman with no operational role in this organization or any other. She was followed. She was attacked. She has a dislocated shoulder and a concussion, and she spent a night in a hospital in Cambridge." His voice did not rise. It did not need to. "I want to be very precise about what I'm telling you, Garrett. That woman is the only reason this conversation is happening in a conference room instead of somewhere considerably less comfortable. I'm giving the Fontaine organization one opportunity to resolve this through conversation because she asked me to let her make her own decisions, and respecting that is the one thing I am currently capable of doing correctly." Poole looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want?" he said. "I want the Cambridge operation completely dissolved, Every asset, every file, every piece of intelligence gathered on that address, destroyed and confirmed destroyed, to my satisfaction. I want the man who ran the fourth position, Dietz, to understand that his career in this business is concluded. I want a written acknowledgement from the Fontaine organization that Vivian Ashcroft is untouchable, permanently. Under any future organizational realignment, he paused. And I want the Fontaine organization to understand that if anything happens to her, anything, at any point in the future, there will be no conversation afterward. There will be only consequences. The room was silent. Poole looked at his lawyer briefly. The lawyer gave no visible indication of anything. Poole looked back at Damien. The Fontaine organization agrees to these terms, he said. In writing, Marco said from the wall. Today. Poole nodded once. In writing. Today. They spent 90 minutes with the lawyers. Damien sat through all of it with the patience of a man who had decided what mattered and was willing to take the time the process required. When it was done and Poole's people had left, Marco closed the conference room door and looked at Damien across the long table. Renato's situation, Marco said. How do you want to close it? He's out of the organization. Completely. His accounts, his positions, his access, all of it ended as of last Tuesday. Damien looked at the table. He cooperated with the full audit. He didn't fight it. He paused. I think he understood that what happened to Vivian was further than he intended to go, and that understanding is the only reason he's having this conversation instead of a different one. Marco nodded slowly. And the organization going forward, his responsibilities. Distributed. I've already mapped it. Damien gathered the papers in front of him. The Moreau restructuring closes in 3 weeks. After that, the European portfolio runs on a leaner structure. It was going to happen anyway. Renato knew that. He was afraid of it, and he made a choice. He stood. The choice had consequences. That's how this works. Marco held the door. And Vivian. Damien stopped. He stood with his hand on the back of his chair and he thought about the question, and Vivian, and all the ways he had answered that question to himself over the past months, the operational answers, the strategic answers, the managed, controlled, organized answers that kept the real answer at a safe remove. I'm going to wait, he said, the way she asked me to. Marco said nothing. She'll come to whatever conclusion she comes to, Damien said. I'll respect it. He left the conference room and went back to his office, and he worked for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening because the organization did not pause for the interior events of its leader, and he did not ask it to. But at some point in the late evening, after the building had gone quiet and the city outside was doing its indifferent nighttime business, he opened the drawer of his desk and took out a ring. It was not the DeLuca family heirloom. He had put that back in the estate safe the week after Vivian left. This was a different ring. Smaller, simpler, a thin band of white gold with a single diamond that any jeweler in Manhattan would have described with professional neutrality as modest. He had found it in Vivian's jewelry drawer when Elena was reorganizing the master suite, set aside from the rest, clearly deliberately separated from the heirloom that had replaced it. She had left it behind. He had not known what that meant, and he had kept it, set it in his desk drawer. And here it was. He held it in his palm and looked at it for a moment. Then he put it in his jacket pocket. He began, in the weeks that followed, to dismantle things. Not the organization. He was not romantic about the nature of what he had built and what it required to keep running. But the architecture around it, the advisors who had spent years treating Vivian as a liability management problem, were moved to positions where their counsel was less immediate. 3 of them resigned, which told him something about their primary loyalty that he filed without surprise. The legal structure of the foundation was reviewed and several board positions were restructured to give it genuine operational independence from the DeLuca corporate interests, which was something Vivian had mentioned once quietly in the first year. She had said she worried the foundation's work was perceived as DeLuca branding, which undermined its credibility in the communities it served. He had noted it and filed it. He acted on it now. He ended the private understanding with the Greco family that had required maintaining a certain public image of DeLuca domestic arrangements. Greco's representative received this information with the controlled displeasure of a man adjusting expectations. and Damien received his displeasure with the equanimity of a man who had stopped needing it. He sent flowers every Friday. No notes. On the third Sunday, she called instead of him. "I got the flowers," she said. "I know." "Damien." "Yes." "What are you doing?" Not confrontational, genuinely asking. He thought about how to answer this. He had a version that was careful and strategic and positioned correctly, and he discarded it before it was fully formed. "I'm trying to become a person who deserves to ask for what I want," he said. "I don't know how long it takes. I'm working on it." The line was quiet for a moment. "Ruth thinks I should stay in Boston," Vivian said, "through the spring at minimum. There's a promotion possibility if the next manuscript I develop does what she thinks it will." "You should stay," he said. Silence. "I want you to have that," he said. "The work. The thing you built out there on your own." He meant it. He could hear that he meant it, which was new. The absence of the slight operational undertone that had always colored his statements about her life. The almost imperceptible positioning of a man framing everything to land in a way he had calculated. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay," he said. They talked for another 20 minutes that night. Not about the organization, not about Renato or Fontaine or any of it, but about the manuscript she was developing, a debut novel by a writer in his 40s who had spent 20 years working construction and had written the whole thing in the margins of his lunch breaks. She described the prose with the specific lit-up energy of someone talking about a thing they genuinely loved, and he listened with the full quality of attention he usually reserved for operational intelligence. And he thought, clearly and without managing the thought, that he loved the way she sounded when she was talking about something she cared about. He did not say this. He said goodnight. She said goodnight. December arrived with the particular cold of a New York winter that meant business, the kind of cold that came in off the river and had no patience for inadequate coats. The DeLuca Foundation's annual gala was scheduled for the 14th. The same ballroom, the same chandelier, the same architecture of money and performance and carefully managed appearance that it was every year. Damien had considered canceling it. He had not canceled it because Vivian had built 2 years of foundation work that deserved to be represented regardless of the status of her marriage. And canceling the event because of his personal situation would have been another version of managing her life to suit his comfort. She called him on the 12th. "The gala," she said. "Yes, I'll be there." A pause. "If that's... I want to be there. For the foundation. Not as... I'm not coming back as your wife. I'm coming back as someone who worked on that foundation for 2 years and wants to see what it's doing." Another pause. Smaller. "I just wanted you to know, so it wasn't..." "I know," he said. "I'm glad." She arrived at the Meridian Grand on the evening of the 14th in a car she had booked herself, which he knew because Marco, with the diplomatic instinct of a man learning new parameters, had mentioned it simply as logistical information and not as surveillance data. She was wearing something dark blue, not a DeLuca stylist selection, something she had chosen herself, and her hair was the Cambridge way, down, and she looked like a woman who had been somewhere and built something and come back to a place she had a history in without being owned by the history. She looked like herself. He crossed the ballroom when she came in. He did not manage the approach, did not calculate the timing or the positioning or who was watching. He simply walked toward her because she was there, and he had been waiting 3 months to be in the same room with her, and that was the only reason he needed. She saw him coming. She did not retreat. She stood and watched him cross the room with the steady, dark eyes he had been looking at in his memory for 3 months. And when he reached her, there were perhaps 8 inches of space between them. And the ballroom. Noise went on around them as if they were inside a separate acoustic environment. "Vivian," he said. "Damien." Her voice was not courteous and controlled the way it had been on the phone in the early weeks. It was just her voice, the real register. "You look like yourself," he said. Something moved in her face. "I've been practicing." He almost smiled. He couldn't remember the last time something had moved through him that felt like that. Not the managed version of warmth that he deployed socially, but the actual thing, involuntary, arriving before he could decide to have it. He did not suppress it. "Can I get you a drink?" he said. "Yes," she said. They stood together near the edge of the room, which had always been her position and which he had never stood in before. He had always been in the center, working the room, while she occupied the periphery. He stood with her at the periphery, and they drank, and they watched the room together, and it was different from every other version of this evening they had shared. It was not a performance. It was two people standing next to each other at a party. 3 separate conversations interrupted them over the next hour. A city councilwoman who wanted to discuss the foundation's new community arts initiative, a journalist who covered the nonprofit sector and had questions about the board restructuring, a researcher from Columbia who had been working with one of the foundation's grant recipients. Vivian handled all 3 with the competence and genuine engagement of someone who actually knew the work and cared about it. And Damien stood slightly back during each one and said almost nothing, and she did not need him to. He watched her be good at something that was entirely hers. When the room cleared for the dinner portion of the evening, he touched her arm lightly, the right arm, away from where the shoulder had been injured, and she looked at him. "Come with me for a minute," he said. She came. He led her to the terrace off the main ballroom, which was cold and lit with small string lights and empty of other guests. The Manhattan skyline was spread out behind them. All that organized light, all that history, the city that had been the whole terrain of his life. He had stood on this specific terrace 2 years ago and put his coat on her shoulders and registered her presence beside him as something that fit, and he had not known what to do with that and had filed it under professional management and told himself it was efficient. He put his hand in his jacket pocket. He felt the ring. He turned to her. She was looking at the skyline, the cold making her breath visible in the air, and she looked at him when he turned, and her eyes held the patience of a woman who had learned to wait without performing waiting. "I owe you a complete accounting," he said. "You've been giving me one," she said quietly. "Not yet." He looked at her. "What I said at the gala, you heard the part about protection, and I believe that was true. But there was something underneath it that I didn't say then because I hadn't let myself know it yet." He held her gaze. "I denied that you were my real wife because I was afraid of what it meant that you had become exactly that. Not contractually, not organizationally. In the places I had spent my entire adult life making sure I couldn't be reached." He felt the ring in his pocket, the weight of it against his fingers, and he did not take it out yet. "You reached them. I don't know exactly when. The coffee, maybe, the tie, the way you asked about things without needing anything from my answers." He paused. "I was afraid of it. I turned it into management because management was the only language I had." Vivian was very still. "I don't have a new language yet," he said. "I'm working on it. I know what it's cost you that I didn't have it sooner. I know you spent 2 years in a life that was carefully organized around my comfort and my operation and my fear, and I know that you held up your side of an arrangement that was significantly more expensive for you than it was for me, and I know that none of what I'm saying changes any of that." He exhaled. "But I want to say it, because you deserve to have it said correctly, even if it's late. Tokiti tui atisi." The city went on behind her. She looked at him with the full, unguarded quality that she usually held in reserve. The quality he had only seen in the very early mornings before the day required performance from either of them, and he understood from the quality of her silence that she was receiving what he said as he intended it. Not as a transaction, not as a strategic position, not as something with an expected response at the end of it. "I left that ring," she said finally. "The simple one. When I packed. I found it. I know I left it. I knew you'd find it. I think I left it because I couldn't figure out what taking it meant, and I couldn't figure out what leaving it meant, and so I just..." She looked down briefly. "I left it there and let it be both things at once." He took it out of his pocket. He held it in his palm between them without offering it. Just held it, in the cold air, in the terrace light, where they could both see it. "I'm not asking you to put it back on," he said. "I'm not asking you to come home or change anything you've built in Boston, or be my wife in any version of the way that word has worked between us before." He looked at the ring and then at her. "I'm asking if you're willing to find out what it could mean when it's not a contract, when it's not arrangement or management or protection, when it's just..." He paused, and for the first time in the conversation he looked uncertain, which was a thing she had almost never seen in his face. "When it's just true." Vivian looked at the ring in his hand. She looked at his face. She reached out and took the ring from his palm, not putting it on, just holding it, the metal warming immediately against her skin. and she closed her fingers around it, and she stood there with it in her closed hand, and she looked out at the city for a long moment. "I'm going back to Boston on Monday," she said. "I know. Ruth needs me through April at minimum. The manuscript, I know, and I need the time," she said. "Not from you, from myself. To be sure that what I want is what I actually want, and not just the habit of hoping." She looked at him. "I need to be sure it's real." "I know," he said, and he meant it, and she heard that he meant it. "The flowers can keep coming," she said. Something in his chest settled, very quietly, like a door finding its frame. "Every Friday," he said. "Every Friday." She looked at the ring in her hand for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "I'm not putting it on tonight. I'm not asking you to. But I'm keeping it." He looked at her face in the terrace light, the dark blue dress, the Manhattan cold making her breath visible. The ring closed in her right hand, and he understood with the flat, clean clarity of a man arriving finally at a true thing. This was not a negotiated settlement. This was not a managed arrangement with updated terms. This was a woman who had come back to a room where she had been hurt because she had decided on her own terms to come back. And she was holding a ring she had not put on because she was honest about where they were, and she was telling him exactly what she needed, and he was for the first time in his life simply listening without calculating the response. "Come inside," she said. "It's cold." He opened the terrace door for her. They went back into the ballroom together, and the room was full of light and noise and people who watched Damien DeLuca with the attention they always watched him with. And he stood beside Vivian near the edge of the room, her position, the periphery, and the heads of 3 organized crime families and 2 federal officials and a sitting state senator were all present in the same room. And all of them noticed, because all of them always noticed, and what they noticed was this. The man who ran the DeLuca organization was standing very still beside his wife and not working the room, not managing the crowd, not positioning himself in the careful geometry of power that he had spent 20 years perfecting. He was just standing there, watching her talk to Ruth Calloway, who had apparently come down from Boston for the Foundation's Arts Initiative announcement, and whose presence clearly pleased Vivian in the genuine way that good friendships do. The ease of it, the specific quality of comfort that can't be performed. He watched Vivian laugh at something Ruth said. A real laugh, the kind that was slightly louder than she intended, that she covered briefly with her hand and then didn't bother covering. He had heard that laugh before, in private, in the Cambridge Morning's version of her. He had not heard it at a DeLuca event before. Victor Fontaine's underboss, Garrett Poole, was across the room. He looked at Damien once with the measured assessment of a man recalibrating, and Damien looked back at him with the expression of a man who had nothing to prove in this room tonight, and Poole looked away first. The evening wound down the way evenings wound down. The gradual thinning of the room, the quiet efficiency of staff beginning to clear, the string quartet finally packing their instruments. Vivian found him near the end of the night, and she said she was heading to her hotel. She had booked a hotel, which he had known and had not offered to change, and he walked her to the building's entrance, and they stood in the lobby for a moment. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed. She had the ring in her jacket pocket. He did not ask about it. She did not explain it. "I'll answer when you call," she said. "You don't have to wait 3 days." He looked at her. "I know what I said," she said. "I'm updating it." "Okay," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer with the dark, steady eyes that had been the first thing he had noticed about her and the last thing he thought about most nights. And then she said goodnight and walked out of the building into the cold December street and got into the car she had booked herself. He watched the car go. He stood in the lobby of the Meridian Grand for a moment, and then he went back into the ballroom to finish the obligations of the evening, because the work continued regardless, and he had spent long enough learning the hard way which things mattered more than work to know the difference. And the difference was clear. 4 months later, in April, a small independent publishing house in Boston acquired a debut novel by a 43-year-old construction worker from New Jersey who had written the whole thing in the margins of his lunch breaks. The acquisition was announced in the trade press with a brief note from the editorial lead, credited as V. Ashcroft. Damien read it at his desk on the 42nd floor on a Tuesday morning and sat with it for a while. Then he picked up his phone and called her. She answered on the second ring. "I saw," he said. "It's going to be a good book," she said. I believe you. A pause that had warmth in it rather than distance. I'm coming to New York this weekend, she said. There's a meeting with a literary agent on Saturday, and I thought, she paused. I thought I might come by the penthouse, if that's... Yes, he said, before she finished. A small sound from her end that might have been a quiet laugh. I'll call when I land. I'll be here, he said. He put the phone down. Outside the window, Manhattan was doing its April thing. The light different from winter, something looser in it, the city's perennial forward motion visible in the way the streets looked after a long cold season. He had looked at this view for 20 years from this window, and it had always looked like territory. Infrastructure. The organized result of everything he had built. It looked like something else today. He sat there for a while longer, not working, which was still slightly unfamiliar and probably always would be. And then he opened his desk drawer and looked at the space where the ring had been, and he closed the drawer and he went back to the work that the day required, and underneath the work, steady and unhurried and no longer filed under anything because it didn't need to be managed anymore, was the plain and unmanageable fact of a man who had spent his whole life conquering everything within reach, finally understanding that the one thing worth keeping was the one thing that could not be taken. It had to be chosen. Every day. Without strategy, without management, without the armor of a man who had once looked at the woman standing 4 feet from a barely closed door and called her useful and meant something true and something terrible at the same time. He had said 8 words without hesitation that night. He was still learning what it cost to say better ones. The work, he thought, was the right kind.